It's a curious thing how legends from our childhood can sometimes turn out to be more than just stories. I used to laugh when I heard tales of creatures in the woods, the kind that lurked just beyond the trees, waiting to pounce when you least expected it. My father would often recount his own brush with something strange during his youth, but I always dismissed it as an overactive imagination or the exaggerations of an old man. But after the events that transpired last summer, I can't say I feel the same anymore. My story begins on a camping trip to the Bearclaw Forest. It wasn't the first time I'd ventured into the woods. In fact, I'd spent plenty of weekends there over the years with friends or family, and nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened. But this trip was different. I went alone, seeking solitude to clear my mind. It was a decision I'd soon come to regret. The first few days were peaceful as usual. I set up camp near the edge of a small clearing, where the forest seemed to open up just enough for a fire without the trees feeling too oppressive. I spent my time hiking, reading, and enjoying the quiet of nature. But by the fourth night, something shifted in the air. It was subtle at first, just a feeling, a gnawing sense that I wasn't alone. I dismissed it as my imagination playing tricks, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing hour. It was around midnight when it first happened. I was sitting by the fire, enjoying the crackling warmth of the flames, when I heard a rustling sound coming from the nearby woods. It wasn't an animal, I could tell that much. It was too deliberate, too heavy for a deer or raccoon. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, scanning the shadows beyond the firelight. Nothing. I convinced myself it was just a deer, perhaps a bear, moving through the underbrush, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was a presence out there, something that was watching, waiting. I returned to my seat by the fire, trying to push the anxiety aside, but it was hard to shake the feeling. It was like the woods themselves were closing in on me. Hours passed and the night grew colder. The rustling sound came again, this time closer, followed by the unmistakable snap of a twig underfoot. I stood up, heart racing, and took a few steps toward the edge of the clearing. My flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees. For a moment I saw nothing, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something moving, too large to be a typical forest animal. I swung the flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there. The clearing felt unnaturally still, the air thick with an unsettling silence. Then I heard it, something that wasn't the wind, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the ground. I froze. The sound was coming from behind me. Slowly I turned, and that's when I saw them. Two glowing eyes, barely visible through the darkness, peering out from behind a tree. They were far too high to belong to any animal I knew of. The eyes were large, amber, and seemed to shine with an unnatural light, almost as though they were reflecting something deep in the woods, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at those eyes, but every second felt like an eternity. My body felt paralyzed, my instincts screaming at me to run, but my feet refused to move. The eyes didn't blink. They just watched, unblinking, unyielding. Then, the creature stepped forward into the dim light of my campfire, and I realized just how wrong my assumptions had been. The thing that stood before me was taller than any human, its figure hunched but massive. Its limbs were long and spindly, covered in dark, matted fur. Its face was obscured by shadows, but the eyes, I could see them clearly now, burned with an eerie intensity that made my skin crawl. It took another step forward, its massive feet making no sound as they pressed into the earth. I felt the ground shift beneath me, as if the weight of the creature was distorting reality itself. The thing did not make a sound, and yet I could feel its presence growing, filling the space around me. In a panic, I grabbed my pack, planning to flee. But just as I turned to leave, the creature made its move. It let out a low, unsettling hiss, and before I knew it, I was sprinting through the forest, my heart hammering in my chest. Branches whipped at my face as I bolted, the sound of the creature's pursuit growing louder behind me. I couldn't see it, but I could hear its heavy, labored breathing, the rhythmic pounding of its steps on the forest floor. I ran until my legs burned, my lungs screaming for air, but I dared not stop. The woods seemed endless, and the darkness had become my only companion. It felt like hours before I reached the edge of the forest, but when I emerged, breathless and terrified, I found myself back at the campsite. The creature was gone, but the fear remained, lodged deep within me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. My mind raced with thoughts of what I had seen. The glowing eyes, the hulking figure, nothing made sense. I was too scared to return to the woods the next day, too frightened to even look in the direction of the trees. But as I packed my things and prepared to leave, I saw something on the ground near the campfire, a large, twisted footprint. It was deep, imprinted into the earth, and unlike anything I had ever seen. I left Bearclaw Forest that morning without a single word to anyone, and I've never returned. But the memory of those eyes, of the creature that lurked in the woods, haunts me still. I've heard others talk about the legends of Bigfoot and other cryptids in the region, but after what I experienced that night, I know one thing for sure: some stories are born from truth. The first time I heard about the Mothman was when I was a kid. My parents would warn me about the eerie creature that supposedly haunted the skies, its glowing red eyes and large moth-like wings visible from a distance. It was just another tale in a long list of things designed to keep me inside at night. Of course, I never took it seriously. That is, until I moved to Point Pleasant, West Virginia, the place where the Mothman was said to have been sighted countless times. I had never believed in monsters or supernatural creatures. I thought the Mothman was just a local legend, something the locals passed down to keep outsiders intrigued, but something changed during my stay in that small town. In retrospect, I wish I had left when I had the chance. But that's not how stories like this go, is it? You don't get to walk away easily from something that follows you, watching you, waiting for you to notice it. It all started on a cool autumn evening when I was out walking, taking in the crisp air. The town was quaint, with its old buildings and the kind of charm that made you think of a simpler time. It was about 6 o'clock, and the streets were just beginning to empty, with most of the townsfolk retreating indoors for the night. I was new to the town, and my job had brought me there. I just finished a late meeting at the office and decided to stretch my legs before heading back to my temporary apartment. As I walked, I passed by the old TNT area, the site where the Mothman was said to have first appeared back in the 1960s. The abandoned factory, with its broken windows and rusting metal, gave off an unsettling vibe, but I didn't think much of it at first. It was just another dilapidated piece of history. I had reached the edge of the area when I noticed a sound that seemed out of place, a deep, vibrating hum. I paused for a moment, trying to locate its source. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't any kind of machinery. No, this was something else entirely. The hum grew louder, and as I turned around, I caught sight of something that made my heart skip a beat. In the sky, just above the trees, was a dark shape, moving against the backdrop of the setting sun. It was huge, much too large to be a bird. At first I thought it might have been a plane, but there were no lights, no sound of engines, nothing. Just the silhouette of a massive creature gliding in the distance, its wings spread wide and beating slowly, almost methodically. I felt a chill run down my spine. My breath caught in my throat as I instinctively took a step backward. I wanted to call out, to ask someone nearby if they could see it too, but the streets were eerily empty. As I stood there frozen, the creature came closer, its shape becoming clearer. The wings were enormous, stretching out far beyond its body, and its eyes, glowing bright red, were staring straight at me. It wasn't just the sight of it that terrified me, it was the feeling. It felt as if the creature knew I was there, that it had been watching me for far longer than I had been aware. That sensation of being hunted crept up on me slowly until it was all I could focus on. I turned and began walking quickly back toward my apartment, my heart pounding in my chest. The hum from above continued, as if it was following me, drawing closer with every step I took. The sky had darkened by now, and the only light came from the dim street lamps casting their flickering glow on the pavement. I dared not look back, but the weight of the presence behind me was undeniable. Every few seconds I could hear the unmistakable beat of large wings slicing through the air. I quickened my pace, my hands clammy, my mind racing. When I reached my apartment, I slammed the door shut behind me, locked it, and leaned against it, gasping for air. The hum from outside continued, echoing faintly through the walls. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see the creature perched somewhere waiting, but there was nothing. The streets were silent once more, as if nothing had ever happened. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there watching. The rest of the night was restless. I lay in bed, the lights off, but sleep would not come. My mind replayed the encounter over and over, trying to make sense of what I had seen. Was it a bird? A drone? A trick of the light? But deep down I knew the truth. The Mothman, whatever it was real. Days passed and I tried to move on. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I had been tired and stressed. But that didn't explain the way the creature's eyes had glowed, or the way I had felt its presence even when it was nowhere to be seen. It was as though it was waiting, watching me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't done with me yet. Over the next week, I kept to myself, avoiding the streets after dark and steering clear of the TNT area. But one night, when I had almost convinced myself that I was just overreacting, it happened again. I was sitting in my living room, reading a book, when I heard it. The hum. It started low at first, like a distant engine, but it grew louder with each passing second. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. I walked to the window and looked out, and there it was again, just as it had been before. The same dark shape, the same glowing eyes, hovering above the trees. I quickly shut the blinds, but the sound didn't fade. It stayed, growing louder as if it were directly overhead. My pulse raced and I felt the walls of my apartment closing in. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I run? But I knew one thing for sure. This creature, whatever it was not something that could be explained away. It was real, and it was watching me. As the days went by, the sightings became more frequent. Every time I left my apartment, I felt the Mothman's eyes on me. It was as though it had claimed me as its next target, and no matter how far I ran, no matter how many times I told myself it was just a figment of my imagination, I could never escape it. I'm writing this now, still in Point Pleasant, still living with the knowledge that something is out there, something that is beyond my understanding. People talk about the Mothman in hushed tones, warning others to stay clear of the TNT area, to stay inside at night. But I know it's not just a story. The Mothman is real, and it knows me. It was the middle of winter when I moved to a small, remote town in the southwestern United States, a place where the desert stretched out endlessly, with the horizon barely visible beneath the sun-scorched sky. The town had a peculiar quietness to it, one that was almost unsettling. People kept to themselves, and the locals were tight-lipped, speaking only when necessary, as though there were things they didn't want to talk about. But for me, it was a fresh start. After a rough few years in the city, I needed peace, and I hoped this little town could provide just that. The first sign that something was wrong came the very first night I arrived. I had been driving for hours, arriving in town just as the sun dipped below the mountains. The place was small, nothing more than a few old buildings scattered along a dusty main street. My new home was a small house on the outskirts of town, on the edge of the desert, a place the locals call the end of the world. I should have listened to the warnings. I should have taken the signs more seriously, but I didn't. The first week was uneventful. I unpacked, settled into my new job at a small local cafe, and tried to adjust to the slower pace of life. But as the days wore on, I noticed things weren't quite right. I'd hear whispers when I walked into the cafe, hushed conversations that stopped the moment I entered. The other patrons would glance at me, their eyes wide, but they never said much. At first, I thought it was just the novelty of a newcomer, but as the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, and not just by the people in town. It started small, just odd sensations, like being followed, or the hair on the back of my neck standing up for no reason at all. I would glance behind me, expecting to catch someone, but there was never anyone there. One evening after my shift at the cafe, I decided to take a walk. I wanted to clear my head. The stars in the desert sky were bright, and the air was crisp. I felt a strange pull to walk out into the wilderness, to venture beyond the town where the streets ended and the desert began. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was just exploring, wandering a little too far from the safety of the town, but the further I walked, the more I realized how quiet it had become. No rustling in the bushes, no wind whistling through the trees. The world had gone still. That's when I saw it. I thought it was just a trick of the light at first, a shadow darting between the trees at the edge of the desert. But then I saw it again. This time it was closer, too close. I froze. The thing I was looking at wasn't quite human. It had the shape of a man, but something was off. Its limbs were too long, its movement too fluid, like it was gliding. The face was hidden in the shadows, but its eyes, they were yellow, glowing, reflecting the moonlight in an unnatural way. I couldn't move. The air around me felt thick, suffocating. My heart hammered in my chest as the creature slowly emerged from the darkness. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, its body unnaturally thin. And as it stepped closer, I could hear it breathing, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was almost as if the creature had stepped out of the night itself, born from the shadows and the land, and now it was standing before me. That's when I remembered the stories. The ones the locals would whisper about when they thought I wasn't listening. The tales of skinwalkers, shape-shifting witches who could take on the form of animals or people. My grandmother had told me stories about them when I was a child, but I never took them seriously. It was just folklore, right? Just a way to scare kids. But now, standing in the presence of whatever this thing was, I wasn't so sure anymore. The creature took another step closer, and I could feel the heat of its gaze. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like stone. I couldn't move. It was as if some force was holding me in place, forcing me to watch this thing, this nightmare, as it drew closer. Its eyes never left mine, and for a moment it seemed like the whole world had disappeared, leaving only the creature and me. The desert had gone silent, and all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing, shallow and frantic. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the night without a sound. I blinked, not sure if it had been real or just a figment of my imagination. My heart was racing, and I could barely breathe. The adrenaline surged through me as I turned and ran, stumbling over rocks and uneven ground, desperate to escape whatever that thing was. When I made it back to the safety of my house, I slammed the door behind me and locked it, trembling uncontrollably. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak of the house, every rustling sound outside made my heart skip a beat. I knew it was out there, waiting, watching. The next day I tried to act normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The people in town seemed to know something. I could see it in their eyes. They were all too familiar with what had happened to me, but none of them said anything. They didn't need to. It was as if they had all accepted that the creature was part of the town's reality, an unspoken truth that no one dared to acknowledge directly. Weeks passed, and I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. The creature had never shown itself again, but I could feel its presence lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting for the moment when I would slip up, when I would slip up, when I would stray too far from the safety of the town. I stopped going out at night. I kept my distance from the desert, from the place where the shadows were darker and the things that lurked within them were more real than I could ever have imagined. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, the skinwalker, or whatever what it was, watching, waiting. And I don't know if I'll ever truly escape it. It wasn't supposed to be a special trip. I had simply decided to take a weekend getaway to escape the grind of city life. A quiet retreat in the middle of nowhere. The Airbnb listing had promised cozy surroundings and scenic views, just what I needed to reset. The cabin was situated in the dense forests of the Appalachian Mountains, far from civilization. The location was remote, but that was the whole point, right? To get away from it all. I had arrived late Friday evening, the kind of late where darkness blanketed everything before you even noticed the day slipping away. The road to the cabin was long and winding, and by the time I finally parked in front of the old structure, the only thing visible was the faint outline of the trees swaying in the wind. The owners, a husband and wife, had been kind enough to leave a key under a flower pot for me, so I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately felt the strange quiet of the place settle over me. The cabin was rustic, wooden beams, a stone fireplace, vintage furniture, but there was something off about the atmosphere. Maybe it was the eerie silence or the way the floor creaked under my feet, but it didn't take long before I started to feel as though I was being watched. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the unfamiliar setting. The owners weren't there, but they had left a little note welcoming me, assuring me that everything I needed was provided. The layout was simple: a small kitchen, a cozy living room, and a loft where the bed was located. The first night was uneventful, save for the faint sound of what I thought was wind howling outside. But when I woke up the next morning, something felt wrong. I chalked it up to the isolation, the unfamiliarity. It was a strange feeling, like the air was thicker in this place, as though the weight of the world rested on my shoulders in a way I couldn't explain. I opened the curtains to reveal the woods around me, a vast expanse of trees stretching into the horizon. I spent the day hiking through the nearby trails, enjoying the fresh air and solitude. The forest was beautiful but intimidating in its own way. The towering trees seemed to watch me with every step, and the deeper I ventured, the more I felt like I was walking into something ancient. A part of me dismissed it as paranoia, but there was a presence there, a heaviness in the air that made my skin crawl. By late afternoon I returned to the cabin, eager for some rest. As I opened the door, I froze. The furniture inside had been rearranged. The couch was in a different spot. The chairs at the table moved a few feet to the left, and the bookshelf that had once been flush against the wall now stood crooked. My heart skipped a beat. No one had been in the cabin since I had arrived, and I was certain I had left everything as I had found it. I checked the windows, all of them locked, and the door was still securely closed. There was no sign of forced entry, no explanation for the disarray. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I had simply been too tired when I had unpacked. But deep down I knew I wasn't alone. That night the wind picked up again, howling through the trees. The sound outside was so loud it almost felt like a physical presence pressing against the walls. I climbed into bed and tried to sleep, but the unease wouldn't leave me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. At some point I drifted off into a fitful sleep, only to be woken by the distinct sound of footsteps in the cabin. I sat up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. The floorboards creaked as if someone was walking slowly around the living room. I held my breath, listening intently. The footsteps stopped in front of the bedroom door. Then came a soft tap, like someone knocking at the door. My pulse raced as I reached for my phone on the nightstand. The screen illuminated with the time, 2:15 a.m. There was no way it was the wind. The footsteps were too distinct, too deliberate. The silence hung thick in the air. I debated whether to check the door. Part of me feared that if I moved, I would find something terrible waiting for me on the other side. But curiosity won out. I slowly slipped out of bed, gripping the flashlight I had brought with me. My hands were trembling as I approached the door. I held the flashlight up, the beam cutting through the dark, and I opened the door just a crack. Nothing. I stepped into the hallway, my breath shallow, my eyes scanning every corner of the room. The door to the outside was still closed, the window still locked, but something was off. A cold chill filled the air, and I could almost feel the eyes of something unseen watching me from the shadows. I backed away, slowly retreating to the bedroom. That's when I saw it, something dark moving just outside the window. It wasn't a shadow, but a shape, something that was there and then gone in an instant. I couldn't tell what it was, but it wasn't human. My mind raced. Had someone been outside the cabin? Or was it something else entirely? I spent the rest of the night wide awake, too scared to close my eyes. As dawn broke, I decided I couldn't stay another minute in the cabin. Something about it felt alive in a way that didn't feel safe. I grabbed my things, intending to leave as soon as possible, but when I opened the door, I froze. The path I had walked down earlier in the day was now covered in a thick fog, a dense mist that obscured everything in front of me. I couldn't even see the road that led back to the main highway. It was as if the forest had swallowed it whole. I turned back to the cabin, trying to steady my breath. The door slammed behind me as I stepped inside, my heart racing in my chest. That's when I saw the old journal. It hadn't been there the night before. It was lying on the coffee table, as though someone had placed it there just for me to find. With trembling hands, I opened it. The pages were filled with strange, disjointed drawings and notes. Some of them looked like the scribblings of someone who had lost touch with reality, but others were much darker, more chilling. There were symbols, strange, twisting shapes that made my skin crawl. A picture of a tree. A hollowed-out figure with glowing eyes. The words repeated themselves, "Don't trust the forest. The forest is watching." Suddenly the front door slammed open. I ran. I didn't stop to look back. I bolted down the trail, the fog still thick around me, and I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I didn't even look behind me as I drove off, my hands clutching the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. As I passed through the last stretch of forest, something flickered at the corner of my vision. I thought I saw movement among the trees, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare. I drove home, not looking back once, and for the longest time I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in those woods, whatever had been watching me, was still there, and it would be waiting for the next person who ventured too far. There was something